Are you the host now? Yeah, is she gonna pause the recording?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Gilli with the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, and today we are presenting our forum on the common misconceptions about herbicide use in restoration. So we have our main presenter, Chip Bubl, will be presenting on natural area restoration and the challenge of invasive plants. So Chip, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, this is a topic that has been a great part of my life as an extension agent for Columbia County for quite a few years. And there are not easy answers to some of these things. Uh, the invasive plant materials, particularly in semi-aquatic systems, are really a challenge, but there are in other areas. So I'm going to try to go through some of the processes that we've thought about over time and look at some of the chemistry that's available and what has, especially for aquatic or semi-aquatic conditions, and especially semi-aquatic conditions. And we'll talk about those as we go. And again, any of you in the audience, feel free to ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So anyway, let me get started. Okay, why is this working now? It's not working. Oh, there we go. So what's changed over the past 100 years? I'm going to come back to this picture again, but this was the first introduction of canary grass, reed canary grass in Columbia County in 1927 by what was called an Oregon Agricultural College extension agent at that period in time. Oregon State University or Oregon State University didn't exist at that time. Anyway, and this was in the Clatskanie area, if you know the area. And the area that this was being done in was an area that had flooded for centuries in the winter, and then in the summer, as the water drew back, it was used for cattle grazing predominantly. And then they started putting up the berms for creating the farming conditions that manage the water during the winter, so that the fields weren't full of water anyway. And then they started adding things to the system, and this is reed canary grass, as I mentioned. So this kind of disruption of the natural pattern of flooding and turning back, you had a lot of plants that were really good for that, and they were actually fairly good feed for livestock. But people want to try other things, and so the idea was you bring this plant reed canary grass in, and you put it up, and you see what you can do. And it was not noticed to be a problem for about 7 years, and by 1935 there were already notices in the extension research that I've looked at for this area that the plant was not quite at what they had hoped for. So that's kind of an introduction to the beginnings of what we were facing with in a lot of situations. So why are creek and river restoration so important? The combination of the water and the botany basically are really important for both the species in the streams and the rivers, and also truly important for the populations of all sorts of insects and salamanders and all sorts of species, both plant species and fauna species as well, outside of the direct river. And so they're very complex situations. They're very complex ecologies. We have turned them into less complex, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But there's right now, the original interest in all this was for the salmon and related fish. There's now a lot more interest in some of the adjacent native species that we have maybe not done as well with as we could have. So recovery's not been an easy job, though. We'll talk about some of the reasons why and then go forward from there. So So how do we approach riparian restorations? We try to find out what the stream ecology and geology was 100 plus years ago. It's not easy to do. In some cases, there were big changes, where you make bank stabilizations and those kinds of things. They were kind of taken apart. The banks were kind of taken apart by some of the logging operations in certain periods of time. For a while, it was these sites had a way of getting back to their normal setting because they didn't often plant the trees after logging. They just left the land to replant themselves, basically, and they would come back in another 70 or 80 years. Then they start to farm the forest a little more intensively, and they went from a rather odd way of deciding when to log, mainly with how much money it was worth, and then got into a environment where they were going to basically log and look to plant the trees back, and then look to come back between 50 and 60 years. What's happening now is that's been shortened a lot, which is going to make a lot of these places more challenging. But because we have a huge amount of industrial timberland in Columbia County, but they're basically looking at between a 28 and 35-year rotation right now. So anyway, the interesting things we want to look at if you're coming to a site is what was the ideal plant mix for the site at the time when things were kind of nice? What plants are there on the site now? It's really important to get a good sense of which plants are doing well, which plants aren't, which plants are native, which plants aren't. So we really need to get that data, and then we can make some decisions as we go through how we can manage that, which ones should stay, which ones should go, which ones could be brought back. So anyway, depending on how the sites have been managed, they usually will develop a huge bunch of plants that are non-native to North America. You can see the what we used to call Himalayan blackberry on the right there. It's now called Armenian blackberry because it turned out actually Armenia was the native source of that. So it's slowly but surely I'm getting Himalayan blackberry out of my mind and Armenian blackberry in there. But anyway, it was a plant that was brought over from Eurasia for food and turned out to be very good for food. I think most of us here can say that we like the berries from that plant, but it also became a very aggressive plant here in the Pacific Northwest, west of the Cascades. So anyway, a lot of other plants were brought over for food, medicines, fabrics, all sorts of different reasons they were brought. Some just came in, for example, like tansy ragwort came in the ballast of a ship in the San Francisco area, apparently, to get started here in the Pacific Northwest. So others came in as livestock feed. It was just random how some of these things got there. There was a purpose for some of them by the people that settled here, and there was no reason at all. Those plants were just around for the trip. So anyway, most of them were from latitudes and climates very similar to ours, which means they're competitive. They like being in this kind of landscape. So why do these plants grow? Why do they do so well? In the picture on the right there is J.C. Venata. I think some of you know him. And that is reed canary grass in an upland site, but next to a creek. And it's over, Casey's at 6'2" at least. And it was 7 to 7.5 feet tall in most of it. So it's aggressive plant. So when these aggressive plants get started, they become clearly aggressive because they lack natural enemies. When seeds move, they usually don't move things in the seeds that were using those plants as a food source, whether it was insects or whether it was animals or birds or whatever. The natural enemies do not come over with the seed. Most of the ones that we have called non-invasive plants are typically non-native. There's very few that are native. They're very fast growing. They're mostly perennial or woody, but some are herbaceous. A lot of them are woody, but the ones that are most serious, especially, except for the grasses. They have a fast reproduction rate. They have very good ability to disperse seeds and or spread by roots systems as well. So that's not good. A lot of them are long-lived seeds, although that's not totally true with everything. So you can't really say that on all, but a lot of the plants will have a seed life in the soil of maybe 30 to 50 years in some cases. So that's not always encouraging. And a lot of these plants seem to have fewer habitat restrictions than native plants. Native plants, in many cases, have very specific places that they really like, the mix of sun and shade, the moisture in the water, how cold does it get in the winter. A lot of them have kind of specific locations that were just fit for them, with over the hundreds of thousands of years that they've been there working on it. So these invasive plants don't seem to have those restrictions. They are sort of a take-all, win-all kind of plant in many cases. And a lot of them, as I note at the bottom, are able to form single species stands very easily, like this canary grass. So how do plants compete? Pretty much it's a battle for sunlight, water, and soil nutrients. And sunlight is absolutely key, as if everything else isn't working well, if the water, they can kind of go dormant for a period of time, soil nutrients, they can move along. But the sunlight is what drives what plant wins and what plant doesn't win in an area. This particular picture to the right was actually an area just outside of Tillamook that I had been watching for a long time. It had some Japanese knotweed. You can see some of that in the front, a pretty big stand of it, actually. And they finally decided they were going to control the Japanese knotweed with an herbicide. And they did that, and I was really interested what was going to happen the following year, how successful they would be. And there was a big surprise, because we got another invasive plant whose name I've, for some reason, forgotten right at the moment. But anyway, it came in underneath and it had been there all the time, but it hadn't been very visible because the Japanese knotweed had taken the site. But there were two non-native species sitting there, waiting for the opportunity to grow. So there is biochemical warfare between some plants. Some of the plants do have root exudates, not all plants, but some do have exudates that damage adjacent species or slow them down, stunning their growth. And so in a broad sense, these plants are weeds because they were also kind of winners at home where they came from originally. So these were very successful plants to get over here as weeds. So what are the most common riparian edge species that make our restoration projects more difficult? I would say if it's a lower elevation site, like along the Columbia or along some of the larger streams and rivers, reed canary grass, if it's there, is a horrible thing to manage. I've seen a number of either private or groups working to remove canary grass and plant other species and hoping that the other species will stop the canary grass from taking it over. And it rarely, if ever, works without doing it just by basically normally either physically pulling stuff out or trying to cover the area for a period of time with dark plastic or black plastic or something to basically cut off the sunlight for a period of time. And I have not seen it really work with reed canary grass very successfully. There are some things that may work, and it's challenging. The knotweed group, there's a series of what we used to call Japanese knotweeds. They do not have seeds as part of their reproduction. They have to be, pieces of them have to be moved around and and during the course of their growth, either by movement of the streams, taking off pieces and sending them downhill. So we've historically worked on knotweeds from the upper part of the infestation, working downwards, because what you want to do is, remove some of the key sources that are upland of the lower part of a creek or a river. So knotweed group is a big one. English ivy is still coming on stronger than ever. I truly wish we had a control for English ivy. We'll talk a little bit about possible options, but it's a very difficult plant to control, and it's not hard on conifers. They don't like the shade that the conifers have in their canopy all year round. I mean, they have all those needles, but they love any of our deciduous trees. So they just like the structure that those trees provide. English holly we used to have a fairly big holly business here in Columbia County and also in other parts of Western Oregon. And English holly is taking off on our own property. We have quite a bit of English holly. It's not a mess yet, but it's getting worse. And one of my plans this summer is to deal with it as much as I can. I will tell you something on English holly, and I better tell it now because I may not tell it. Do not cut it without treating it with an herbicide, because what happens when you cut English holly is that you will then have maybe 15 to 30 sprouts come out of that English holly where you've cut it. And then to do it, you're going to have to come back and eventually treat that, because I don't know of any other way to stop it. So anyway, with English holly, that is one you can do with one piece of work if you do it right. Anyway, Armenian blackberry, but we do have some good treatments for that. It's not one of the worst ones to have. Scotch broom is a challenge, but it does need open ground much more than some of the others. It needs the sunlight. Spurge laurel, some of these others. So anyway, we'll talk about a few more of these in just a second. We need to know the life cycles of all. It's very important. So how site-specific is the plant? Garlic mustard, which is not uncommon here in Columbia County. There's quite a bit of it around. Herb Robert it seems like it's kind of stopped to a certain extent. It's not as bad as it used to be. And spurge laurel, these are all understory plants for the most part that can really handle lots and lots of shade and do just fine. So understanding that and understanding the timings of that, those plants when they come out, when they set seed, those kinds of things are super important. So with that site, those plants on the understory plants, they're pretty good in there, and they don't have nearly the competition that some of these others do. The ones that kind of go after canopy control, like ivy and clematis and the knotweed complex to an extent, you could say reed canary grass, Scotch broom, blackberries, all of them are looking to control that landscape, control the light flow, and have that flow coming through their leaves and their sugars and their roots and their structures, and then their seeds and other ways of moving further. So anyway, there are a few plants that do pretty well in both. I would say ivy and clematis are pretty good in understory conditions. They are quite good at understory conditions because, especially, I found, I have not worked with the Clematis vitalva as much. We do have some, mostly seemingly down in Rainier area. But anyway, with the ivy, I know they have in their ivy brains the idea that they will eventually get the sun and they will eventually flower and set seeds and do all those things. So they like the sun, but they will survive with the promise of sun in some of the lower solar availability ones. And then we had the aquatics, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about aquatics. It's partly not a specialty of mine, but we do have a lot of aquatics that are changing the balance of what is in our creeks and our streams and our side channels and all those things with the Columbia and the lower parts of a stream or creek in some conditions near the Columbia. So all these sites are biologically sensitive. Most of these sites are very important sites for a lot of the things that we're trying to recover. But the problem is these things are spreading quickly. I mean, English ivy really was not a problem when I first got here about 45 years ago. And there are areas where it's, unless there's a really long control process that takes place, it's not going to be stopped. So what is lost if we do nothing? It's bad. I don't even want to think about it, because all the things that were valuing the plants that were there before the clematis or the ivy or any of these canary grass get going, it changes. So we've lost a lot. We lose a lot. So site restoration is really tough. The non-native species are really tough. And we have not used fire here as a restoration tool, partially because it's hard to set fire to our landscape when we've got so much rain. We have, depending on where you are in Columbia County, anywhere between 40 and 60 inches of rain from somewhere in October to somewhere in April or May when kind of it starts. And fire's kind of dangerous just doing it in the summer, because that isn't, that's not super safe. So we haven't used that as a restoration tool here very much. I'm not saying it couldn't work in certain settings, or there might be tools to make it work, but I'm not really sure that I've seen anything that would be it would be a long process to get that to go. So selective and what we call non-selective herbicides are often the only tools that make any sense from a labor and financial standpoint. But they are also, as you might think, a disturbance, at least to some degree. So we have to think about what we're going to do in terms of control options, and we're going to kind of look at the scale of restorations and influence on potential success. And then we're going to have to think about the beaver that are part of our system and often give us some problems. Right at the end, I'll have a little discussion on plants that beavers don't like. So anyway, general guidelines: learn to recognize and eliminate noxious weeds before they get really established. Reduce weed seed production as a minimum action. Replant with the appropriate species. And so we're looking for those appropriate species, native species that are potentially competitive in that landscape, and maybe won't be eaten to bits by the beaver, but we'll see. And then control weed competitors early and often. Give the things that we planted 5 years minimum until the desired species have really taken hold. Sometimes we've done projects, and not this group, but projects have been done that people have walked away from, and it doesn't last. It just doesn't last. So it's really important, if we're going to put the effort into it, the manpower, the money, the thought into these restorations, we want to make sure that there is an effort to make it. In some cases, it's just a situation where you've worked with a really good person. They're very interested in what we're doing and understand it and do a good job. And then for whatever reason, they sell the property and go. And then it's all, unless you know what's happening, you don't have a chance to talk to the new owner maybe very easily early, or you might not even know that it's happening until somebody's down the line. So when it's been sort of reconstructed back into the more challenging weed group. Okay, so weed control principle number one: act quickly but methodically. So if we see new infestations, this is the early detection stuff. And so you're going to try to pull seedlings, young plants. Root systems haven't been developed, and you're going to want to pay attention to these new infestations in an area, especially if it's a plant, an invasive plant that we don't see very much. We'd like to stop it as much as we can. And I know we've had some examples of doing that to some degree. Established infestations, if it's a seed producing product, and most of them are, but not all of them, you want to slow the seed reproduction of new plants. That's ideal. And then because a lot of them spread by running root systems and things like that, you're going to want to look and see how you can handle reducing those invasive plants and what decisions you have to make to be effective to do that. So weed principle number 2, there's not that many choices, are there? I mean, manual, pulling and digging, mechanical, bringing in equipment to basically pull and dig and mow, chemical, herbicide, and biological, looking at natural enemies. If we can do it, a combination of these methods is really the best. An integrated pest management system, if possible, can be can be a good tool or a good set of practices, but it's not always as easy as that, and maybe the time and the money available to do some of this is not really available. So anyway, let's get talking a little bit. It costs a lot of money to do these restoration projects, and we want them to be successful. We want them to last. Biocontrol is kind of at a standstill. I'll talk about that a little bit more. There's a variety of reasons for that, but we don't have the biological controls coming out like we were getting in the 60s and 70s, and I'll talk about that in a second. The cost of using only human and mechanical labor to remove heavy weed infested sites is escalating fast, and oftentimes on a lot of our weeds, which have strong root systems that can create new plants, you're not going to get all of that. You think you're getting it, you hope you're getting it, but you're not getting it, and so it tends to come back fairly quickly, depending on the site and depending on the weeds you're dealing with. Some, for example, if you cut blackberry every year close to the soil for 2 or 3 years, you'll knock out those blackberry fields pretty well. If you keep them short and you keep cutting off their leaves, you actually can control blackberry without any kind of a chemical option whatsoever. But then in a lot of cases, to do anything that's actually potentially going to show some ability to restore some of these sites, you've got to think about some of the chemical options that are available and that may help you create a stable restored site. So anyway, let's go a little further in this. So biological control. I don't know if you recognize the tansy ragwort there, and if you look up in the corner, there's I guess I can show it, but there's some little caterpillars that are orange and black, go around on them. And they do a fairly good job on biological control. They were introduced in about 1974, I think, here in Columbia County. And it was something I got involved with, putting them out early on. But I had actually done some of that in another county in Oregon where I lived before I came here. And so it had been around for a while, 72, 73 maybe. There's another insect that goes for the root system, and that's actually more effective. But really, for all intents and purposes, with tansy ragwort, we have had a biological control that has kept those things down. And because it is toxic to the tansy ragwort is toxic to cattle and horses, but not sheep and goats. There can even be use of some of the livestock in controlling the tansy ragwort. So anyway, that plant was one we got fairly good control, and they went back to Europe where the tansy ragwort was from, and brought back these species, these two insect species for this area, and it worked really well. The problem is that the risk of bringing in insects from another place is really challenging, because your biggest fear as you're bringing something in is that it's not going to go just for the plant you want it to go to, but it's going to go to something that you haven't anticipated, and that something could be commercially significant. And so a lot of these biocontrol systems have come to a big stop over a period of time. Or I won't say it's a stop, but it's a big slowdown. And the kind of expectations that I think a lot of us had 35 or 40 years ago on some of these invasive weeds, that we could find some species that would be good enough to bring in here and would not do any damage. It's just not, it just hasn't happened very much recently. So it's not the tool we were hoping it would be. Manual control, if you have dedicated people that were willing to take on hard sites and recognize that coming in one day and doing something is great, but coming in the next day and the next month and the next year is even greater, because a lot of these, like Scotch broom, it will come back unless you somehow manage to get the roots out. And there are some, for young Scotch broom plants, there are some tools that will help with that. But anyway, manual control can make a difference. And if you reduce the sunlight deprivation that these species have in their system, so that other plants can grow, that can maybe help. But you're going to be facing, as you go into the project, you're going to be facing doing this for 5 to 8 years, multiple times, to really get any lasting control. And I will tell you, Scotch broom seeds live between 40 and 50 years in the soil, and that's not comforting. So mechanical control, again, you're trying to reduce the sunlight deprivation that these species are taking, and in some cases they're taking some of the water that's in the landscape that some of the other trees or shrubs would need. And so as they get very vigorous in their growth and they start capturing the sunlight and then capturing a lot of the moisture, that can be pretty good, a pretty tough deal for you to get in and get control very quickly. But when you can combine manual and maybe chemical control, or mechanical and manual, and those kinds of combinations, manual and machine control will help if you can do it consistently, and then maybe adding chemical control, which we're going to talk about next, can be important. But as I note, weeds usually resprout after mowing, so we do have to watch. This is not a one-time deal. So chemical control, it's very effective for short to medium term control. With some of the products, you have to know the right timing in the plant growth cycle for each control project. What is the right timing for your particular plant you're trying to control with a particular herbicide? They can be very effective. They can be used very poorly. Doing it at the wrong time is one of the ones that's one of the worst, because you've done it, but it's just not getting in. And if there's something that is desirable that's within these plants that you're using a chemical, an herbicide on, you can harm desirable plants. So you have to know what you're doing and be very careful about how you pick the product and pick the situation, the timing, and all those kinds of things to actually do it. So when you look at labels for products, we're going to get into this on the big three in a minute. But when you look at labels for products, you really want to make sure that it's labeled for the location that you're talking about. And So yeah, that's really important. You know how you're going to use it, where you're going to use it, and is that particular product, because we have, with different herbicides, we have different structures, if you will, of the composition of that herbicide with a few other compounds that make it work in that particular location where it's going to be, whether it's an aquatic location or a non-aquatic location, those kinds of things. So anyway, you're going to hopefully be a good label reader. So understory species or perennials. Are there any questions? I mean, am I going just sort of randomly through the world, or?
I haven't seen any questions pop up yet.
What's that?
I haven't seen any questions.
Okay. So understory species, these can be difficult to control. They can stand shade. This particular plant, Lesser celandine, does have some seeds. It also spreads by a bulb, and this is a slide taken in St. Helens, in a forested area in St. Helens. And I haven't looked at that site now in a long time, so I do not know whether it is still there or whether a native plant has taken over. I would doubt it. But it is clearly an understory species, although it can be out in full sun as well. We have English ivy, which is an understory species, I would say. So is Clematis vitalva, as we talked about earlier, English holly, and spurge laurel. All of those are ones that that can stand the lower light intensity and still basically capture the landscape for themselves versus the things that were there when they first started growing there. So anyway, that's one grouping that we'll talk about. There's the Clematis vitalva. Like I say, I've seen most of this for some reason in the Rainier area. I don't know. Have you seen any in the Scappoose area of Clematis vitalva?
I have.
Okay. It's a really noticeable one if it gets going, and people think they like it at first because it's kind of a pretty flower, but it can really take off. There's quite a bit of it in Portland and a variety of places now. So anyway, this is a woody perennial that it looks beautiful. It's called spurge laurel, but it's got some sap that's dangerous, and yeah, it's showing up again. The seeds are being moved by either animals or birds moving around for that. Our full sun competitors are the ones we spend most of the time on, though. So the knotweed complex you see here, basically what the knotweed has done is taken areas along this creek or river that would have had a variety of different species here. Could have been alders, could have been a whole bunch of native plants here, but all of a sudden, all it is the knotweed complex. So, and it has no seeds. I mean, it does not spread by seeds. It spreads by pieces. And so, normally you start upstream and go downstream with it because of the piece spread. How it gets to the main place, the high elevation point, in some cases, is often a mystery. But anyway, it is wise to work down. But it's taken a lot of plant material that would have supported the insects, that would have supported the fish in the system, and taken it away and there's no evidence that they produce anything that the fish want to eat, although I wouldn't say that it's possible. But basically, by and large, it is not a good thing for a riparian landscape to have knotweed as a big part of it. So, and there are parts in Columbia County, some in Clatsop County, that are still really, really tough. Scotch broom, gorse. We don't have much gorse, luckily, in Columbia County. We found a few sites. Scotch broom, we do have a fair amount of, though. We talked about that a little bit. We talked about reed canary grass quite a bit. Purple loosestrife, yellow flag iris are both here in Columbia County, mainly right along the Columbia River, not very far upstream at all. It's pretty close for the most part. There's a little more purple loosestrife upstream than very little yellow flag iris. So anyway, those are some of the ones that are full sun competitors that are biggest challenges. So, unintended herbicide consequences. If you're going to do a large herbicide application, you need to contact your neighbors before and let them know, the neighbors of the site that you're working on, and let them know what's going to happen. And you want to avoid exposure to either organic, conventional herbicides. That means wear protective gear if you're doing it, or the people you've hired are doing it. And don't over apply, kind of follow the directions on the labels. And the key thing is to know the best timing to control these target weeds and to avoid injury to desirable plants. So you really do need to survey the landscape of these plant materials, the dangerous, weedy, nasty plants and the desirable plants, and figure out what is the best time to get the target weeds and avoid injury to the desirable plants. And that takes some thought, and it can be different in one part of the project than another. So herbicides for invasive plant control in forests and forest edges. So glyphosate, this is, there's aquatic and non-aquatic forms of glyphosate. Accord, there are a bunch of products with various labels as to where they're supposed to be used. The important thing to understand about glyphosate is that it moves where the plant sugars are moving in a given plant. And so, for example, if you're looking at a deciduous plant, the sugars are starting to change and not going up as they do in the spring, but start going down to the root system. And the storage parts of the tree or the shrub or things like that, they start doing that in the fall. And so that is the time that, in many of these, and again, there's some variations, but in many of these, understanding that glyphosate flows where the sugars are flowing in woody plants. It's super important to remember that. And it has to be absorbed through actively growing leaves. So that's kind of the way glyphosate works. There's some different labels for aquatic use, so we're not going to talk about that right now. Another active ingredient is called triclopyr. There's a number of different forms of it, amine and the esters. The esters are less complicated and relatively safe on some plants at certain times of season, desirable plants. It is absorbed through leaves and stems and green trunks. It isn't dependent on the sugar flow like the glyphosate is. So it has more of a longer cycle of use, generally, basically from sometimes in the mid to late spring on through parts of the summer and into fall. And then imazapyr, which some of you, these are called, these are the chemical names of these plants. Imazapyr there's aquatic use formulations and non-aquatic use formulations. The aquatic use, as any of these, if they have an aquatic use product, has very special labels for the aquatic use. You need to know them, and ideally you'd have a license to do that. Imazapyr is effective, but it has chemical root activity, which the other two do not. So, for example, triclopyr and glyphosate cannot exude from the roots of a treated plant and affect something else. They just can't do that. They have no direct soil activity that way. Imazapyr does. And it depends on the desirable plants in the area, whether that would be an issue. But you need to learn something about its activities, and reading the license is the beginning of a starting point, and then talking to other people who may be your dealer for buying some of these products, learn about its activities in that way. So anyway, let's talk about a couple of these. So glyphosate has been around since, well, it was patented in about 1972, and it was brought to market in about 1975. It has it had at that time compared to almost all the other herbicides that were available, a tremendously good safety profile, in as much as we understood safety at that point in time. It had immediate wide adoption in agriculture and forestry and homeowners, and just as the patent on it was about to run out, it got a new life in what's called genetically modified agricultural world, with any herbicide, you will find that some plant, if you put it on something like glyphosate, you put it on, it doesn't damage the plant. And so Monsanto at the time was realizing its patent was expiring, and they knew that the only way to extend the value was to figure out how plants survived, the genetics, in essence, of how plants survived, the glyphosate, and then take those genes and basically transfer them into crop plants so that then they would be able to not die if they were sprayed with glyphosate. So that's what happened with genetically modified cropping systems. Basically, about 95% of the corn and cotton and a little bit less of the soybeans are genetically modified crops to resist damage from glyphosate. And so it can be sprayed around it, and the weeds killed, but not the crops. So anyway, you probably all knew that. But anyway, the key thing, as I mentioned before, I think on this, they're absorbed primarily. Glyphosate absorbed primarily through photosynthetically active tissues. It's non-selective. Translocates with the flow of the sugar. It's crucial, as I mentioned, to know that. It interferes with an amino acid synthesis pathway found only in plants and microorganisms. And it's a specific enzyme disruption of a particular set of amino acids. So anyway, that's kind of the way it's built. Water solubility, very soluble in water. Soil movement, glyphosate binds to soil particles, and basically vertical movement in soils is usually less than 6 inches, mostly 1 to 3 inches. So it does not move through soils. If the soil particle moves itself, in other words, if that particle is moving during a winter water flood, for example, some of those can move, but it doesn't change. It doesn't change that it's still bound to that soil particle and is not active. And it has no volatility unless you spray unless the droplets are too small and those are moving, but there's no volatility once it's on the plant, which is good. And this is just looking at how deep the glyphosate goes in soils, and it's very, very shallow. It's tied up very quickly. It doesn't go deep at all. And then glyphosate degrades into carbon dioxide, salt, and some other compounds. Degradation in soils varies by the soil type and moisture and temperatures and the chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. It's those kinds of things as you would expect. The typical half-life of glyphosate in temperate soils with adequate moisture seems to be about 50 days. And if you are in an area that is very short on moisture, like parts of Eastern Oregon, it can go longer than that. But typically in Western Oregon, the half-life which means half of it's degraded in 50 days. And the next half is in another 50 days. And so anyway, that's typically what we have as the half-life. And the half-life is not active. It doesn't have any herbicidal characteristics of the ones that have degraded. Glyphosate fully degrades in water faster than in soil, 30 to 90 days, again, depending on the soil chemistry predominantly. So, okay, so let's look at some toxicology with glyphosate. And I don't know if you know anything about what we call LD50s, lethal dose 50%. With any kind of product sprayed on a crop, they're going to look at the toxicology of the product, what we call the acute toxicology of a product. And they will feed a bunch of rats X amount of the active ingredient, the next bunch X plus more, and then another bunch X plus more, until you get the number for which for which it stops having any kind of damage. So lethal dose 50%. The lower the number, the more lethal it is, because the less it takes to do it. So the higher the number. So we've got some products that most of them are off the market model, but there were some that were like 3 and 6 and things like that. With glyphosate, we're looking at 4,300. But this is acute toxicology. Okay, low bidermal exposure, again, not a big deal, not a skin sensitizer. Very low by inhalation in terms of issues. It is a signal word, caution, and if you know caution, warning, and danger are the series of terms you'll see in big letters on the container itself. And caution is the lowest in terms of toxicology. Warning is the next more challenging, and danger is, you better read this label really, really well and know what you're doing. So, and then again, there's no bioaccumulation and excreted in feces and urine. So this is, the toxicology of this is actually very, very good. The toxicology actually of caffeine, the LD50 of caffeine, is about 260. But again, dose makes the challenge. Other species toxicology, birds, it's basically considered practically non-toxic. Fish, slightly practically non-toxic. It's a little bit, but not a lot. Aquatic invertebrates, slightly to practically non-toxic. Again, amphibians, moderately to slightly toxic. And originally there was a formulation of glyphosate that had a secondary ingredient in it that actually was a really bad deal for some of the amphibians, but that has been off the market for roughly 30 years. So that mix is gone. It's practically non-toxic to bees, practically non-toxic to earthworms. So surfactant issues. This was the one that POEA that was initially formulated with the glyphosate products, and it was an endocrine disruptor, and it's not in these products now. So we won't see that. So some other issues on genetically modified crops. We are getting resistant weeds. They're mainly annual so far. If they're using in their cropping system glyphosate over and over and over again, these plants are moving their genetics around, as any good living thing does. They try to deal with whatever stress they're under, and if they're being stressed by the same thing over and over again, they will start developing genes that either reduce or completely stop the impact of glyphosate or any other compound that has these same kind of consistent things that are going on in the farming, predominantly east of the Rocky Mountains. So they aren't large-scale issues around here because we don't grow those kinds of crops. We're really talking about corn, soybeans, and cotton for the most part. So animal studies of glyphosate have had mixed results, mostly negative. There was a long-term study of over 50,000 applicators using glyphosate and found no association with overall cancer rates or any of the subtypes. So that was a pretty substantial study, about 10 or 12 years ago. Epidemiological data shows mixed association with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's very inconclusive. We're going to talk about that in a second. The EPA classification is evidence of non-carcinogenicity. So here's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There's been a lot of discussion about that. I got interested in this because exactly of the questions that we were having with glyphosate and whether it has an impact on it. The first thing, I didn't know anything about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma when I began looking into this. Basically, the largest predictor of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is getting older, by far. This is a 50 to 60 to 70 degree, 70-year-old person or more that is more likely, even though it's not a very common thing, it is much more likely as you get older. So this was true before glyphosate was brought in, and it's still true. Some of the things that we know can develop non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, rubber production, Epstein-Barr virus, which is interesting, hepatitis C, glycosporin, which I don't know much about, Heliobacter, which we now have different treatments for. It's not a problem anymore much, and HIV/AIDS. So those are ones. Some other concerns are benzene, gamma radiation, hepatitis B, dioxins in some of the early herbicides, 2,4,5-T particularly. There were some issues with dioxins. So there's not much indication that the concern about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and glyphosate is really a true concern. But again, we can talk a little bit about more of that. One group made a study with glyphosate, and they compared it with other things that were in the same area of concern that glyphosate was, and so eating red meat, eating pickled vegetables, indoor emissions of burning wood, high temperature frying, and late night work shifts were all, if there was any concern with glyphosate, these were other things that were of concern in the same frame of concern, basically, I guess. And the glyphosate would have been safer than processed meat, all alcohol drinks, chocolate because of the lead and cadmium that the residues that they get from growth in soils that don't necessarily get taken out when they're brought into chocolate bars, sunlight and engine exhaust. So basically, the issues around glyphosate do not appear to be ones that justify the concerns that have been so common with that. But I think partially because it was such an effective product that it did get used a lot. Does anyone have any questions on this or want to visit on this? Yeah, okay. Okay, let's move on to triclopyr. The rest of them are a lot shorter because they don't have the same level of history of discussion. So triclopyr came into the market in 1979. It is unlike glyphosate, which is both grasses and broadleaf plants. Triclopyr is a broadleaf only product. So it's used for brush control and anything that you want to control that's potentially a broadleaf plant. It is selective. In other words, it won't damage grass. There are some broadleafs that it doesn't affect very, very much either. Some are weeds, some aren't. So you do want to follow labels and see whether in the label that something you're spraying it on for a control of a weed, that it actually works on that weed. The label is going to tell you quite a bit about that. And then do some look to see if there's anything that it doesn't do, so you would know that you wouldn't have to bother spraying that. So anyway, this triclopyr entered the consumer market in about the mid-'80s. There were two salts, two formulations, an amine and an ester. So it's not uncommon. The aquatic uses are amine products, so there are some aquatic versions of some of these. So triclopyr is readily absorbed through leaves, stems, and bark. So I think we talked about that earlier. And the timing and movement through the plant is not as strict as the timing flow like it is for glyphosate. So that you have much more time to use it in terms of the uptake of it. It has very low potential for root uptake, just like glyphosate. It doesn't go through roots. It gets tied up before it gets to the roots or can get into the roots. So it moves systemically through the plants from the leaves into the roots, and it's very effective on the plants that it is used on. So, as I mentioned, less dependent on the timing of the sugar flow, which is important. I think yeah, I think I'll go on from that. Water solubility is very soluble in water. Ester, not so much. The esters are never very soluble in water. The ester products need to be really shaken up when you're trying to get an even mixture in the water of any of the triclopyr types of products. Soil movement, it doesn't bind as tightly to soil particles as glyphosate or Roundup does. It does have vertical movement and binding, can go deeper, but it still doesn't damage roots. It doesn't get in through roots. So it's 5 to 20 inches. It's there, but it doesn't have any impact on the plants, pro or con, depending on what you're trying to do. Once it's in the soil, it's just there. The volatility, though, of the ester is a big deal. There are some versions that mix 2,4-D and triclopyr into a mix, and it's sold for small farmers, homeowners, that kind of thing, and that has extreme volatility. And I've seen quite a few issues with people either damaging plants that they didn't want to damage, or damaging plants of a neighbor or another business nearby. And so it's a chemistry related thing. I suggest that if you're using an ester formulation of triclopyr, to not spray if the temperature would be 75 degrees or higher, even 8 to 10 hours after spraying. So it's something to really pay attention to, because it can land on a plant and then volatilize off a plant on the ester forms if the temperatures are high enough. So that's important, I think. Here's just again the soil picture. You can see they go quite a bit deeper, but again, they're non-active. And then degradation, a little bit longer half-life, or about the same, really. 1 to 90 days, depending on the usual variables. So, yeah, that's kind of the kind of process with this product. And these are very useful products in certain situations with our restoration. Again, depending upon what's there that you want to save and what's there that you want to get rid of, and how you can use this product, or if you can use this product, the way that's set up in those areas. Very low oral exposure. There is an issue with triclopyr, especially with the ester, and so you want to make sure there's some serious eye sensitivity. So make sure your eyes are really protected as you're mixing and as you're spraying. You want to make sure you're protected there. It's got a signal word of caution, and yeah, so yeah, and danger with a couple where they have the eye issues. So it's non-irritating, low toxicity by inhalation, rapidly excreted. So, okay, and then this one, it's practically non-toxic, or with the esters, moderately to highly toxic with fish. That's why we don't use those in the aquatic situations if we're going to use them at all. The same kind of thing as we go further with invertebrates, moderately toxic, not use the non-toxic version. And then I don't know about ester formulations in honeybees. I've never heard anything, but the assumption where I've seen that it's practically non-toxic. So we have had some surfactant issues not mixing well, and those can be a challenge sometimes. So The last herbicide we're going to touch on is imazapyr, and this was developed in the late 1970s, but wasn't patented until about 1989. Its uses were primarily for controlling broadleaf competitive species in commercial and conifer forest regeneration. It was later adopted for more invasive weed work, and there are aquatic formulations. One's called Habitat, and there's some others. The interesting thing is that it is effective on many grass and broadleaf species. You have to read the label to know what it does and what it doesn't do. There was up in Washington along the coast, there was a grass species in Williford Bay that was destroying the oyster growing there that was coming in. It was a non-native species that had gotten somehow into the system and was destroying the bay, basically. And imazapyr was what they used to, from what I understand, effectively change the pathway of those grasses and get the area back to what it was beforehand. I think maybe they're doing some spot treating at this point. But anyway, it has some interesting uses. But one of the worst uses that I've ever run into in my time was a company that put a mixture of imazapyr and glyphosate, Roundup, put together in a homeowner product. And the reason is that unlike the other two, as I mentioned, imazapyr can go into the soil and be picked up by the roots. And so I had somebody here in Columbia County who bought this product, thought it was what Roundup was, which is bound up on the soil, was spraying next to a grapevine, basically, and didn't get it on the grapevine at all, but it had this product, this combination of imazapyr and glyphosate, and the imazapyr got in and torched the grape roots, which torched the grape plants. So this has been a really bad decision. When I was working, I would have one or two calls a year, and I know there were a lot more out there of people who had used this. And if you look at the label, it says gives you a year of control. Well, if you know Roundup by itself, glyphosate, the minute it hits the soil, it has no control. Okay, and so people should recognize that there's something different, but they don't. And they don't realize how much damage they can do to trees or shrubs or a variety of things, that the root systems are there where they don't realize they're there and can kill the trees. So mode of action, non-selective, used at very low application rates. As I mentioned before, readily absorbed by roots, unlike glyphosate or triclopyr, fairly well absorbed by foliage and to a lesser extent by stems. So you have to be careful not to damage roots of desirable plants if you're using this on site for something in particular. Very, very important thing. And physical properties, high water solubility, potential non-target damage, maybe over 100 days. Potentially, it's not really totally clear. There's an irrigation restriction for 120 days after use. So yeah, you do have to be careful. So. And degradation, half-life of 1 to 14 days, so it does degrade very quickly. So it's a photo degradation process. So soil half-life 30 days to 5 years. We don't really know about this one too much yet. This is still unclear, but that's why we tell people to be thinking about what's going on around it. But I think 30 days to maybe up to a year is more common. 5 years is in very dry locations. And there's no degradation mechanisms that we see in plants so that they can't degrade the active ingredient. They may recycle the compound repeatedly, but if they're not susceptible to it, it doesn't matter, because ultimately it will just remove it from the system. And again, relatively very safe in terms of toxicity issues. So, yeah. Okay, so I wanted to sort of end this part of this with growing wheat canary grass for wetland restorations. To me, it's one of the worst biological introductions of the Pacific Northwest. It should never have been brought here. This is a local picture, a person that worked on weed things 20 years ago with us. Herbaceous perennial with a tremendous growth potential. It's just an incredible plant as far as I'm concerned. It has the capacity, depending upon its site, a water site or an upland site that might only be 50 feet away. It has a capacity to change its sort of chemistry to allow it to turn off some things that they needed in the water and turn on some things that they didn't need in the water but need in the upland areas. So it is, yeah, it leads to a very, I've called it botanical napalm. It leads to a very persistent monoculture. That's my use of language. I showed you this picture originally. It was on the Beeson farm. What was the Beeson farm? 1927 in Columbia County by the first major extension agent in Columbia County, a guy named George Nelson. So he got the seeds and they put it in, and for a while they liked it, and then they didn't. So yeah, it is easy to establish, unfortunately, and as you know, spreads by running roots very, very easily. So it takes over both seasonally moist and somewhat dry upland areas. It came, I believe, it likes the lower Columbia system. It likes the tidal system. It likes the riparian edges along the dike lands, along the diked areas. They can move inland very easily. Gets in very easily. As I mentioned, it has a capacity to turn genes on or off to meet the site constraints. So, yeah. The interesting thing is with cattle that if you look just at what we call the sugars and the proteins in cattle, it would lead you to X amount of, for every 10 pounds you ate, you would get X amount of new protein that would produce X amount of flesh or gain in the cattle. And the weird thing is there are so many strange alkaloids in this plant that it has an impact on the ability of the cattle to really utilize all the nutrients that are in there. And so it's never there. It's not what you would expect it to be. It is still a feed, although there are some sheep, particularly the hair sheep, that it can actually kill. So it's a mess. We should never have done it. And I really believe that the white-tailed deer recovery is really limited by the amount of their grazing area that's covered in reed canary grass, because it's not good for them either. I quite believe, although there's probably been some genetic separation as over time to get some, genes. Some genes will show up in the system that will help with the plant's growth and development, the deer's growth and white-tailed deer growth and development. But still, I think it's not a good thing compared to what was there before. So, what are our options for reed canary grass? Basically, you need 2 feet of water for 2 years. I would say 3 feet of water if you could do it. 3 feet of water for several years or much longer. Yeah, 2 or 3 years to try to get rid of this particular plant. If you can't get a good, plant that will compete with this, which there aren't many that will. So flood it with 2 to 3 feet of water if you possibly can. There've been a fair number of mechanical removal. I remember one, I didn't actually see it, but talked to the person that was managing the situation for a place near Eugene that they had dug, I think, 6 feet deep out and put it into a big pile and covered it in, I don't know, black plastic or something like that and let it decay. But the area that they pulled out all that stuff from to get rid of the reed canary grass, it looked for a while it worked, but it didn't. There was enough stuff there, just pieces within the system, and it took them a while to really get started. But it moves with an incredible pace once it gets going. So what are the options? The herbicide options are aquatically labeled glyphosate. It has an excellent initial knockdown. If you immediately go in to plant some of your other things, you're not going to be able to treat it again unless those happen to be resistant to glyphosate, which very few things are. So there are a few grass-only herbicides that can give us that some people have better results with those afterwards than others, I guess. I've seen one project that I think worked pretty well, and that they had gone in and put in broadleaf plants and stuff like that. So the product they were using was, a grass-only plant. So anyway, the initial knockdown glyphosate can do a good job. The aquatically labeled imazapyr is very effective, but again, just as we were talking, there can be some residual issues on other nearby desirable plants, but it is becoming, I think, the product of choice for reed canary grass in situations where it is appropriate and won't damage some other desirable products. When can you plant into a treated stand? I think you want to wait until you know that it's not going to, that it's not coming back, that you really have got a treated stand that's in good form. Can you use landscape fabric with planting holes? You can. I know reed canary grass, depending upon the thickness of the landscape fabrics and things like that. You can stop reed canary grass, at least in those areas. It might end up coming out the edges. The questions are, does the site flood? Does it really work? Is it going to work for you enough? I don't know. I think some of the plants that compete best with it are willows, red oaks, or dogwoods, and any conifer that you can establish on these sites to shade reed canary grass. Alder does not shade reed canary grass. It just doesn't. It's not enough. And then beaver are a big issue because some of these plants are going to be growing fairly slowly, and if you take away the competition with the reed canary grass by having the beaver eat it, that's part of the issues too. So there are maybe a few herbicide options post-planting. As I mentioned, some of these grass-only, clethodim, slithoxidem, or fluazafop, or careful spot spraying with aquatic glyphosate or imazapyr may be options, but the spraying stuff is going to be really, really specific if you've got other plant materials in the system already that you want to save. You're probably safer with glyphosate than you are with imazapyr, but imazapyr may be a little bit more effective. So you have to kind of judge your situation and go from there. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I don't know this, I wish I had more experience than I do. We can plant these whole systems and then find that the beaver basically want them, and because we planted things that they love. And so I think it is important to find which plants they really don't like and maybe try to use some of these in these semi-moist streamside type environments in Western Oregon and Washington. So we recently saw on a tour some Sitka spruce, and they had done really well until some elk came to rub on the trunks, and that destroyed them. Sitka spruce if you give it the opportunity to grow and keep it free from, and the beaver generally won't eat it, and if you can keep the deer and elk from rubbing it, I think that's potentially an excellent beginnings of a significant closure in terms of sunlight for some of these moist streamside areas to reduce some of the things that might be growing beneath there. I was surprised when I knew beaver don't eat cascara. I don't know, or didn't know until I dug into that neither do deer or, to the best of my knowledge, elk, although I don't know much about elk. So they're not interested in it either. It is more tolerant in semi-moist areas than I thought it would be. And so I think even though, it's just a summer plant, it's not going to keep down grasses totally, it might be a fairly good thing. We had a real interesting project trying to get more shade in the creek down in Benton County, towards the coast, and they put up a bunch of alders, and it all worked for about maybe 8 to 10 years. And this was a big project. It was like 2 or 3 miles of alder. And one year, the beaver came and took them all. And so you really want to think about how complicated your thing could be, and how potentially you could put things that the beaver won't eat. And maybe the deer will leave somewhat alone, or that can recover from deer browsing. So anyway, Indian plum also came out as a possibility. And apparently the beaver ignore that. Pacific ninebark thrives in really wet soils, and I think we're using that, I think fairly significantly. So I think that's worth a try. And I didn't realize, although I should have known because I've seen this particularly down in the Clatsman and Dykeland area, that red or blue elderberries seem to work in riparian settings as well. So I'm not sure about deer. Years ago we had a blue elderberry plant in another place we lived, and the deer in that landscape never did eat it. So I just, but apparently they are not. It's not that interesting to deer or to beaver. So that's good. And apparently with red osier dogwood, beaver can cut it, but because it regrows so incredibly fast, it is a good bank restoration type of a project. And I didn't realize actually snowberry, which is not one that the beaver like, and nor do from what I can tell, the deer like much. It actually is fairly okay with sort of an upland moist situation. So it's probably worth looking at too. This was just a quick try as I was working on the end of this to look at some of the options to plant things that will hold this site from the plants that want to take it from us, the non-native plants, and can stay there long enough to actually maybe have some protection for it. So anyway, that's kind of the set of slides I've got, and talk I've got. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or be more than interested from ideas and successes or failures you've had.
Yeah, and at this point, I did want to open it up for questions for just a moment. If anybody wants to type in their questions, we can get them. We can read them and answer them really quickly. Did anybody have any questions? I'm not seeing anything. Sophie, I see that you're on here. Oh, maybe, here we go. What were some of the grass-only herbicides that have had success with reed canary grass?
Walnut.
Grass
Grass only.
The three,
Cefoxidone.
Those are the three but they're not
But
as good. They're not as good
as
as some of the other products. They're not as good, for example, as a Mazepur. but they can work. And it is, so I think canary grass is very complicated genetics, and you could potentially have
a set of canary grass that actually is genetically different enough that any one of those three might work better than the other. So what I would do is start trialing them. If you have a particular area you're working on with reed canary grass, start trialing them and see how much control you get. Do like 20 or 30 feet uh, um, with one, and just do a trial and see what you get, because all of them have some effect, um, but they don't all have the same effect every year, which is weird. But grasses are challenging for sure.
I think that answered their question.
Are there any other questions before we move on to Gilli's presentation? Give it just a couple more, give it another minute or so to see if any other questions come in.
Have you ever worked with the city to remove invasives from draining ditches and such? Do you know if they'd be open to it? I feel like that's more of a question for me.
Yeah, so here at the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, we do work with the local municipalities to remove invasives. As far as like draining ditches, not all of them. It really just depends on where they are. A lot of the draining ditches in our area are probably more like county or even then like the department like ODOT maintained. Yeah, or the drainage districts, which are a little bit trickier. We we work with the city within the parks and we manage some of their storm systems. And they're really open to it. And we also work with the soil and water conservation districts, both West Multnomah and the Columbia Soil and Water Conservation District, and they work with the county as well in other areas. We also work with the county to give them best practices, but and the other local municipalities. We've been really successful at managing lots of invasives within the parks, especially along waterways, but especially the noxious ones like poison hemlock, just because they can be a little bit more troublesome for people walking through the parks. So I think that answers your question. I think they're a lot more open to it. A lot of them have worked with even CHIP to try to get people on staff licensed, but then they still really do need some assistance because they, although now they'll help with like the herbicide and the weeds, they still aren't fully trained to know what plants are good as far as the natives. So the municipalities do tend to reach out and we tend to work together with them on things like that. And we still have one more presentation here, so I think that we'll get them switched up. So why don't you two go ahead and switch. And Gilli, our Williford, our vegetation manager here at the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, is she just recently obtained her aquatic herbicide license, but she's also had a long-standing interest in aquatic plants for a number of years and worked at a number of places dealing with aquatic plants. So she has a lovely presentation talking about aquatic weeds and the uses of herbicide in them. And again, feel free as we go along. I'm gonna pop off here as she gets up and going. Feel free to ask questions and we will monitor them in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Let's get Gilli going here.
Can you see my slideshow?
I think so.
Okay, perfect.
No, that's still chips. So you have to switch the screen
Oh, gotcha.
on
the Zoom.
on Zoom.
Sorry, guys. Okay. There. Awesome. All right. All right. Hello. I'm Gilli Williford. I'm the vegetation manager with the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, and I'm just here to give a brief presentation on the role of herbicide in ecosystem restoration and how the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, how we use and utilize herbicide when we perform ecosystem restoration. So some of the questions I'm aiming to answer with my presentation are why and how does the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council use herbicide to restore the local ecosystem? What is ecosystem restoration and why are watershed councils involved? Why is herbicide a useful tool in restoration and how do we use it? How does the council use herbicide when we perform restoration? So watershed councils came about in 1997 when coho salmon were listed as an endangered species. So the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds was created. It's also just referred to as the Oregon Plan. And its main goal is to restore salmon populations, water quality, stream flows, habitat, and watershed health. So their local governments were very highly encouraged to start watershed councils. And now in the state of Oregon, there's about 90 watershed councils that are recognized. We're statewide, we're nonprofit, we are non-regulatory, and we use collaborative partnerships to perform and achieve restoration goals. So we work with private landowners, local governments, soil and water conservation districts, and volunteers. And everybody lives in a watershed, and that's why also watershed councils and ecosystem restoration is very important. Everybody is affected by it. So the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council mission is to educate, restore, and preserve. And I'm going to be focusing on the restore aspect of that, restore being ecosystem restoration. Habitat restoration, environmental restoration, those are all terms for the same thing. It's a very relatively new field in ecology, really came about in the 90s and is still, new studies and discoveries are being made in the field currently, which is very exciting. But ecosystem restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. It is an intentional activity that initiates or accelerates an ecosystem to recover relative to a reference state or an appropriate reference model. So that will mean, unfortunately, now most of our environments are too degraded and damaged and destroyed to be returned back to pre-colonial standards. So we now have to have a new reference state or appropriate reference model that we can create new standards to meet what goals of a functioning restored habitat looks like currently. So it's both factoring in, historically, pre-colonial, what did this area look like? And now currently, what native plants are growing currently in this area and will do well with the new conditions that these sites have. So it's a lot of things to consider. And one very big thing you need to understand and consider when trying to restore a failing ecosystem is that biodiversity is most important in what is holding a healthy ecosystem together. So disturbance and degradation of an ecosystem enhances the likelihood of an invasion in that natural community. That's why vegetation management is extremely important, because vegetation are the organisms that give physical structure and complexity to an ecosystem, and they provide energy for that food web. So again, like I mentioned, that's why vegetation management in particular is priority when restoring sites. And you usually will do site preparation, which is the removal of invasive plants, both, as Chip kind of mentioned, integrated pest management methods, being able to do manual, mechanical, and chemical ways of removing invasive plants. Then when we get a handle on, managing those invasives, we'll come in and we'll plant native plants to outcompete the invasive vegetation after the initial treatment of removal. And then after that, it's maintenance and monitoring, continuous manual, chemical, and mechanical maintenance of invasive plants, and maintaining the health of the native plants that were put in. So we'll talk more about invasive plants. Chip went very much into detail about invasive plants and which ones we really deal with in Columbia County and in Oregon when we do habitat restoration. But I want to mention that invasive, weed, non-native, and noxious are terms that are used interchangeably. Sometimes they can have differing meanings, but they're used interchangeably, meaning a species that has a demonstrable ecological or economic impact. So invasive plants have historical and physiological traits that allow them to exploit disturbed ecosystems. Very rarely will an invasive species act like a native species would in that ecosystem. These invasive species are, only newly coming in, have not co-evolved with native plants, native animals for time immemorial that native species have. So they act extremely differently. They create monocultures, which is where it's just one culture of one plant taking up, acres and acres of land. And obviously that is not biodiverse at all. They can cause dramatic changes to the food web, displace native species, and also predate on the native species. So invasive plants and animals are one of the most, if probably not the biggest, threat to biodiversity in ecosystems. Invaders directly and also indirectly impact human health as well. A lot of invaders that we have are poisonous, both if you ingest them, also if you touch them. They increase allergens. A lot of them are vectors of disease, and also worsen wildfires, which, especially being here in the Pacific Northwest, is very, very bad for us. I wanted to point out these two photos I have on this slide. Chip was mentioning tansy ragweed and its biocontrol, the cinnabar moth. On the left, I have a photo of the cinnabar caterpillar on the tansy ragweed. So that is the biocontrol agent that was released to eat this tansy ragweed. Pretty cool. And then on the right is actually the CZ Trail currently. We have this beautiful sign warning that poison hemlock is present in this area right in front of a beautiful big monoculture of poison hemlock. Poison hemlock, if you're not familiar, it is phototoxic. It'll cause rashes if you touch the sap, and is also deadly if you ingest it. So bioinvasion management, where do herbicides fit in when managing vegetation? So like I said, vegetation management is a significant component in habitat restoration to improve biodiversity, the physical structure of the habitat, and to provide needs for native species. When it's too late to employ preventative approaches, managers need to make decisions about how to manage established invasive species in invaded ecosystems. So when achieving eradication can be feasible in some instances, when you have really big, widespread invasions, it's really challenging to detect and to remove these species. That's why herbicide is very useful. And I want to briefly talk about pesticide licensing and the Oregon Department of Agriculture commercial pesticide applicator license. that is the license that I hold, and many people who are doing environmental pesticide control all hold this license. So there's a base test everybody has to take. It's a laws and safety exam, and then you get your categories after that, and each category is also a separate test. So I have my laws and safety, and I have 2 categories. I have forestry and aquatics. So in order to have all that, I had to take 3 proctored tests that were given to me by the Oregon Department of Agriculture. And then, you know, once you passed your test, and you have to apply for your license, and then you'll get your license in the mail, and you are then able to commercially apply pesticides. And I wanted to point out, Chip was mentioning aquatic use herbicides. The Environmental Protection Agency will label specific herbicides as for aquatic use. Meaning that when you're doing, you know, spraying riparian species such as reed canary grass and knotweed, that if this herbicide is to drift into the water, it is not going to harm the aquatic ecosystem. So I have a picture of Aquaneat is the glyphosate formulation, the aquatic formulation of glyphosate. And then that is EPA certified to be used near and in water when applying. The really main point I want to make in this presentation is that judicious herbicide use can be more protective and less impactful to the environment compared to other methods of control, and also compared to not controlling invasive weeds at all. Running heavy machinery around and many other things are more impactful to the ecosystem and can cause more harm than a foliar application of glyphosate. Herbicide is a tool that makes restoration possible. You can treat a very large area effectively with very little physical impact, a manageable amount of labor, and it's economically favorable. The 2 types of application ways that I apply herbicide, the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council applies herbicide, is called a foliar treatment or spot spraying, which in the photo I have right on the left, that is some ivy, English ivy that is crawling up that tree that is treated foliarly with herbicide. So that is spraying it directly onto the plant, onto the leaf, and it has to be actively growing and have the leaf out to be able to suck up the herbicide. If you spray a trunk, if you spray, you know, a stem that has no leaves on it, it is not going to affect the plant. It has to be directly on the leaf, the vegetation of the plant, for the plant to be able to, you know, suck the herbicide in and fully take it into its system. And then on the right is called a cut stump treatment, which is used for weedy trees. So holly and such like that. I'm pretty sure the tree on the right was a cherry laurel. Cut stump it, you cut it down, chainsaw it as close to the ground as possible, and then you will spray the stump with herbicide. And those are the 2 main ways that invasive vegetation is taken care of. So when I'm out in the field and I'm applying herbicide, it is very direct, it is a very small amount, and I can identify which plants you know, need to be sprayed, which plants need to be avoided, and can be very, very particular about which plants I'm choosing. So this is my last slide. To wrap it all up, I just wanted to kind of bring back my main points. Watershed councils use collaborative partnerships to perform and achieve restoration goals. Restoration is an intentional activity that initiates or accelerates ecosystem recovery relative to a reference state. Vegetation gives physical structure, complexity, and provides energy for the food web. And that's why vegetation management is very important in restoration, because it enhances biodiversity, and that is key to restoring ecosystems. So herbicide is one of the best management tools we have for managing vegetation and restoration, and that's why we use it, and that's why the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council uses it. Yeah, that's it for my talk. If you have any questions, we'll give a second, can, you know, type some up.
You can see questions on your end.
Oh, yes, let me look.
So.
Okay.
Do you tend to apply herbicides at a particular time of year, or do you do it year round?
I do it at a particular time of year, and it is dependent on the species I am treating. So spring, this time of year, is going to be the time I'm treating perennial species like mentioned poison hemlock when they're in the rosette stage, their first year of life. In the spring, when they start popping up and they're very active, I will be spraying those ones. And then in the fall is also a really good time of year to be spraying other types of vegetation like knotweed and Himalayan blackberry and stuff like that. So you can apply it year round, but typically it's in spring and in fall, and it is very species dependent.
Some presentation.
What species will the council help me control? Yes, we have a weed grant with the with just the Oregon and their thank you. Yes, we're working at the Columbia Soil Water and Conservation District for their weed treatment grant, and that specifically is help treating weeds like garlic mustard, policeman's helmet, and spurge laurel. Those species are EDRR, early detection rapid response species. If you see those are species that the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council has money to come out and help remove for landowners and for other uses of land.
And then I'll pop in here before we give a quick goodbye. If any other questions pop up, we can answer them. But we also are here for technical guidance on weeds, so don't hesitate to reach out to our info at email or give us a phone call. Things like poison hemlock and a number of other species, although we may not have the resources to come out and treat them for you, we may be able to assist and or give you the proper guidance in order to treat them. We are looking at some fall course on knotweed removal with the Oregon Extension Agency and the Columbia Soil and Water Conservation District that'll go over herbicide mixing and a number of other things specific to knotweed. And then we are looking at some spring workshops as well for other weeds. So we can provide the community with those resources as well. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have a question about some weeds on your property.